Hi, I'm Eric Nino, and I'll be talking about work I did with my supervisor, Michael Bonner, on how manifold dimensionality scales with the performance of deep learning models for biological vision. CNNs accurately explain activity across visual cortex, and the representations of these CNNs and neural systems in general can be understood through their geometric properties. One of the most important of these properties is latent dimensionality. Going from left to right in these examples, as more PCs are necessary to explain a set of neural responses, we can think of their latent dimensionality as increasing. Now, dimensionality plays a big role in nearly every aspect of computation, but it's poorly understood in theoretical models of visual cortex, such as CNNs. There are arguments in favor of low dimensionality as a means of increasing robustness and invariance, and contrary arguments for high dimensionality as a means of increasing expressivity and generalization. In this work, we address the question directly by looking at how the dimensionality of CNNs relates to their performance in explaining activity in visual cortex. And we found a robust trend in which higher dimensional models performed better. But before I show any results, let's build some intuition about what we should expect to see. Imagine starting out with a model that only represents a single latent dimension, such as object size, and then gradually adding more dimensions. Not all of these dimensions will be represented in visual cortex. The brain is invariant to a lot of visual features that aren't ecologically relevant. However, even simply by chance, some model dimensions will overlap with neural dimensions, and the probability of these overlaps increases the more dimensions the model has. Here I'm depicting overlapping dimensions in red. So, in expectation, high-dimensional models should better predict neural data. These are results from a simulation we constructed, with model dimensionality on the x-axis and encoding performance on the y-axis, where encoding performance just signifies how well a model is able to predict neural data. With that theory out of the way, here's how we run our empirical experiments. We first pass a set of stimuli through a CNN to extract a matrix of activations at a given layer. We then measure how well these layer activations explain neural data by training a linear encoding model. And through cross-validation, we can measure how closely the encoder's predictions match to true neural responses on unseen data. Here we're using a monkey electrophysiology dataset with recordings from IT neurons in response to object images. We then run PCA on the layer activations to estimate their dimensionality. Specifically, we're using a metric called effective dimensionality, which is similar to asking how many PCs are required to explain a fixed percentage of variance. Doing all of this for one layer of one CNN gives us a single sample for the relationship between dimensionality and encoding performance. We need more samples to measure a correlation, so we repeat this process for multiple layers. And we also repeat the process for many different CNNs. So every point in the final plot comes from one layer of one model. And our CNNs span different architectures, training tasks, and training data sets to make sure that our results hold as a general rule. Our hypothesis is that we'll observe exactly what's predicted by our theory simulations, with a positive correlation between dimensionality and encoding performance. It's important to note, however, that this isn't a predetermined outcome. For instance, it's been argued that the visual system works by compressing information through a low-dimensional bottleneck. So we might expect a negative correlation in which CNNs that do a better job of compression tend to learn more brain-like representations. Finally, dimensionality might only play a minor role relative to other factors like the training task and dataset, in which case we might expect to observe a weak correlation or none at all. So what do we actually observe? This plot will show our main results. The x-axis indicates the dimensionality of a CNN layer, while the y-axis shows that layer's encoding performance. What we get is a clear trend in which encoding performance increases very reliably as a function of dimensionality. And I want to emphasize how surprising this result really is. When neuroscientists build computational models, they're thinking about things like the semantics of the features, the training tasks, the dataset, and the architecture of the model. However, this much simpler summary statistic of the representational geometry is predicting the performance of models that vary across all of those factors. Now, I want to address some alternative, but theoretically uninteresting explanations for our results that might be coming to mind. For instance, you might be wondering if layer depth is a potential confound because it affects both encoding performance and dimensionality. Or maybe the number of units in a given layer could trivially explain these results, since more features generally translates to higher dimensionality and better regression performance. However, because we had a large number of different CNNs with the same underlying architecture, we were able to control for both of these confounds by looking at our results within individual layers, where we still saw strong correlations. Another potential concern is in regards to overfitting. Intuitively, if the regressors in a linear model are very high dimensional, they might overfit the training data. We can rule this out though, because we're looking at encoding performance on unseen data through cross-validation. One more thing that I want to discuss about these results is the presence of outliers and what they might mean. Specifically, we see some low-dimensional models that perform well and some high-dimensional models that perform relatively poorly. Also, just in general, even though there's a tight correlation between dimensionality and encoding performance, there's still a lot of unexplained variance. Now, in any study, there's generally outliers and variance, but the reason I want to highlight them here is that this is actually something that we expected to see in our results. Dimensionality cannot be the only thing that explains encoding performance. To think of a trivial case, imagine an extremely sparse code where every dimension only responds to one stimulus. This model would be very high dimensional, but would obviously overfit the training set and have no ability to predict neural patterns for novel stimuli. But we can also relate this back to the simulations I discussed at the beginning of the talk. At that time, I said that as we add more model dimensions, the probability of overlap with ecologically relevant features increases. However, that's just a probability. There's no guarantee for any particular model. We might have a low-dimensional model that happens to align with very ecologically relevant features such as object size, and we might have a high-dimensional model that misses those features entirely. Maybe the dimensions are instead sensitive to the kinds of features that vary in adversarial examples. Again, the presence of these outliers is not a problem for our theory. Our theory actually predicts that they will show up. What we expect to see is only that the encoding performance will increase in expectation as a function of dimensionality, which does indeed seem to be the case. Let's summarize all of this and think about what it means. We developed a theory backed by simulations which predicts that neural encoding performance should, in expectation, scale with model dimensionality, and that's exactly what we observed in our empirical results across a wide range of CNNs. These results may have big implications for the field. It's possible that dimensionality plays a fundamental role in encoding performance, and that other factors such as the architecture, training task, or dataset primarily act through their effects on dimensionality. Finally, our study focused on CNNs, but it would be interesting to see if these results generalize to arbitrary computational models in the field. And with that, I'd like to give a big thank you to my lab for helping with this work, and to you for watching my talk. See you at the conference.